name for the studio.
Have you now? What is the name?
Anonymous, yeah. This is the Charles Carroll recording studio that I'm now working in professionally. For those of you who have no clue what I'm talking about and don't get my strange sense of humor, Chuck is a good friend of mine and was generous enough to actually fly down to Charleston, and we hung out, we had a great time, but he also helped me to actually set up my entire recording studio. So right here I have a beautiful new microphone, right there I have a beautiful new soundboard, and against these entire walls, including some of the ceiling, I have sound foam to try to improve the quality of my voice. So I hope it's worked out.
You've got studio quality, man. You're ready to do the voiceover for your next book. I'm telling you. Like, you know, if there's an audio version of the cookbook, I don't know that there will be, but I say just go ahead and voice it yourself. You sound crystal clear.
I'm actually going to do that.
Are you?
Well, not the whole book, because I don't have enough time to do the whole book. It takes a lot of time. But I am going to do parts of the book, and I'm also going to add some, I'm hoping to add some bonus sections so that people are excited to get the audiobook. Like, I'm going to add some extra elements in that.
Oh, that's fantastic, man. And you certainly have the setup for it. And yeah, we did have a blast. And by the way, I had no idea that the plant-based scene in Charleston was as healthy as it was. I mean, we hit a couple of slamming restaurants that had some phenomenal plant-based options on there. There you go. That's right in your beautiful neighborhood there. You were wearing my old pants. But yeah, man, I mean, it was just a fantastic time, and the 2 days I was down there, they just flew right by. But I'm glad that we got the sound, but let's help the people out, my friend. You ready to do that?
Let's do it.
All right, so we're going to open up the doctor's mailbag. That means get your questions in right now. Put them in the comments or in the chat. You can send them to me on Twitter or Instagram at Chuck Carroll, WLC. We're going to get to as many as we possibly can here today. And right off the top, Dr. B, I want to talk to you about colorectal cancer because this is something, obviously, as a gastroenterologist that is near and dear to your heart. But recently, you also got a dose of your own medicine and did what you have said is perhaps the single most important step in cancer prevention. You, right there, where are you right there? Tell us what's happening.
Please don't judge me based upon this photo, everyone at home. So it was a moment where I dropped my guard from a professional perspective, and I had just finished receiving a colonoscopy. I had my first colonoscopy. There's a family history of advanced colon polyps, and so because of that, I actually started colon cancer screening at an earlier age. And, you know, I think that the important thing that I want to get across, so ignore the fact that I'm being a little bit over the top, or maybe really over the top with this photo, but I was excited because I found out that I was safe. And that's what I was really on a mission to find out in getting this colonoscopy at an early age. I just wanted to know that I was safe. The problem is that colorectal cancer is affecting far too many people in the United States. Like literally 150,000 people are going to be diagnosed in 2022 alone. And this is beginning to affect people who are my age at an increasing rate, at a rate that I find to be disturbing. We've discovered that rectal cancer is 4 times more likely in people who are born around 1990 relative to people who were born in 1950. Colon cancer, twice as likely in people who were born in 1990 compared to 1950. It's a radical change.
Do we know why that is? I mean, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the overall rates are going down, but it is this younger demographic, though, that you were just saying, that the rates are so much higher. So what is happening there?
Yeah, so and that's a great point. Overall rates are going down, but they're not going down because of our diet and lifestyle. Overall rates are going down because people after age 50 are getting colonoscopies. Not all of them. Far too many of them are not. And there are alternative choices if you're not going to get a colonoscopy. But to me, a colonoscopy, you can see the choice that I made. I'm a gastroenterologist. This is literally what I've been doing for a living. And given the choices that I had, I chose to get a colonoscopy. I'm happy to run through some of the reasons behind that. But the point from my perspective is that when you get past age 50, we've actually bent the curve. What that means is that we actually have seen that since we started doing this colonoscopy program in people after age 50, we've seen a reduction in the incidence of new cases of colon cancer. We're actually preventing new cases, not just finding them early. We're preventing new cases. And this is despite our diet, despite our lifestyle, despite the health issues in the United States that actually are risk factors. But why is there this shift towards younger people, Chuck? You know, we used to think of this as, oh, only people after age 50 get colon cancer. That is not true. I have diagnosed tons of people in their 40s, and every single time, it is completely heartbreaking because you know that they're just like me, they have a young family, and if we could have only done a colonoscopy earlier for those people. So
let me jump in here because I know that this is a really kind of controversial topic, especially in the health circles. I want to jump right to a question from Stephen, and Stephen's question at 1212 is how can they prevent? And you tell us, I don't think that it's necessarily a matter of prevention, but catching it early, is that right?
It actually is. There are ways that we can go about this, Chuck. But I think it's important. So, you know, my view on healthcare, diet, and lifestyle is that we are foolish to do one and not the other, right? We're giving up opportunities to do things to improve our health if we choose one and not the other. Our healthcare system does nothing with diet and lifestyle. That's a huge problem. Diet and lifestyle is a great opportunity for us to reduce the burden of colon cancer, but it is not 100%. And if you believe that it is 100%, you are wrong. It is not 100%. You can eat the perfect diet, exercise, sleep, have zero stress. There is still a very real risk of developing colorectal cancer. Flip side, we are foolish if we only do diet and lifestyle, and we say, well, I don't want to do healthcare. Right? I don't want to take advantage of preventative screenings that are available to me that I've already paid for with my health insurance. So to me, the best is taking both worlds, bringing them together. And frankly, this is what I'm trying to do in my professional career, is to say, yo, Western medicine, what are y'all doing? We need diet and lifestyle. But flip side, y'all in the diet and lifestyle space, like, get your colonoscopy. This is how you stay safe. So to me, it's about doing both. The diet that is best in terms of preventing colorectal cancer is a high fiber diet. It's stuff that I've talked about in my book. Fiber feeds microbes. Colorectal cancer, the origins are actually in the gut microbiome, Chuck. So disturbances of the gut microbiome can manifest way downstream years later with colorectal cancer. And part of the way that you know this, it's quite fascinating. They've been able to teach dogs to smell cancer. Like dogs can literally smell it. Right? So it's a gut microbiome problem. When we consume fiber, they feed the gut microbes, they release short-chain fatty acids, and those short-chain fatty acids directly attack precancerous cells and disrupt the process that ultimately can lead to cancer. Fiber is our friend in the fight against colorectal cancer. In a study by Andrew Reynolds, published in The Lancet in 2019, he showed not only does fiber reduce the risk of colorectal cancer, I'm talking about dietary fiber, not only does it reduce the risk of colorectal cancer, but it's actually a dose response, meaning that more fiber, more protection. But that doesn't mean that 100 grams of fiber per day reduces your risk to zero. You still need to get a colonoscopy. This is why I had my colonoscopy, even though I eat a whole food plant-based diet with tons of diversity. You still need to get your colonoscopy because there's a very real risk. And I've had people who refuse colonoscopy on the grounds that their diet and lifestyle is so good, and then they get cancer. And they wish that they could change that decision.
And what do we know about the rates of colorectal cancer for people who are eating that plant-based diet versus people eating the standard American diet?
If you look at we often, when we're creating inferences about dietary patterns, one of the challenges is that colorectal cancer is a moderately rare event. I mean, this is not like a super rare event. We're not talking about 1 in 1,000. We're talking about 1 in 20. That's a lot of people if you think about how many people were in your high school. 1 in 20 people in the United States will be diagnosed with colorectal cancer during their lifetime. That's a lot. So, but we need enough vegans and vegetarians and pescatarians and semi-vegetarians. We need enough of those people to really study this. So what do? We turn to the Adventist health studies. And the Adventist health studies, because the in the Seventh-day Adventist community, there's a disproportionate number of vegans and semi-vegetarians and vegetarians. We're able to take a look, and what we see, Chuck, when we look at that, again, this is the Seventh-day Adventists, and most would argue that their form of a vegan diet is not a junk food vegan diet. They're actually eating a very healthy vegan diet. And within that study, there's about a 22% reduction in the risk of colorectal cancer. That's not something to besmirch. Like, that's not something to diminish. That's a great thing. Like 22% less colorectal cancer, I would jump with joy, because that translates into tens of thousands of people in the United States that don't have to go through this. But the flip side is that there's still 78% that still end up getting it. And that's still way too many cases, so this is why we need these programs.
No question. And really quickly, before we open it up to the floor, to take questions from the exam room, and so you just got your colonoscopy this past month. When would you schedule your next one? Is it every 5 years?
So I'll speak for myself and explain the circumstances, but then I want to open this up and explain more. I want to put on my gastroenterologist hat for a moment. So for myself, I have a family history of colon polyps, not just polyps, but actually advanced colon polyps. And so as a result of that, I started screening for colon cancer at an earlier age. And because of that, even though I did not have any polyps on this colonoscopy, amen, I'm so grateful for that, but I am going to come back in 5 years for my next colonoscopy.
Now, for a person who's considered average risk, meaning that you don't have any family history of colorectal cancer or advanced colon polyps.
Without that, then most people in the United States are going to start colon cancer screening at age 45. This may vary if you're in a different country. So screening programs vary by country. You need to talk to your doctor, but the point from my perspective is to take this seriously, and when the window of opportunity opens where it's like, okay, now you're at an age where you're allowed to do this, do it as early as possible, because this shift towards younger populations says to us that we need to be vigilant about trying to find things before they happen as much as we can. So most people would begin colon cancer screening at age 45 in the United States. That's a new recommendation. It used to be 50. We just changed it because of our concerns about what we're seeing out there with the shift towards younger people. And if you have a negative colonoscopy and you don't have any colon polyps, then you would come back in 10 years. It's once every 10 years. That's not that big of a deal. On the flip side, if you did have polyps, then we would tailor the recommendation on when you come back based on how many polyps, what kind of polyps, that kind of stuff.
And true or false, if a person tends to have a healthier gut, generally speaking, their risk of colorectal cancer would be lower, correct?
True. That would be true. If you have a healthier gut microbiome, does reduce the risk of colorectal cancer. But again, I have had people who are yoga instructors who eat a plant-based diet and they meditate 3 times a day and they develop colorectal cancer, or they have very, very advanced polyps. So I wish I could claim that I know going into a colonoscopy who's going to have polyps or advanced polyps or cancer. I wish I could claim that I knew that. I don't know that. It's not a highly predictable thing. There are elements to this that are beyond our control. And for that reason, again, like my message to everyone today is play it safe. Take advantage of the screening that is available to you, either through the health insurance that we pay for, or through the government programs that are in the country.
All right, let's get some specific questions here. We'll start with Steffi. We talk a lot about fermented food when you're on the show. I know you're a big fan of sauerkraut. So Steffi is wondering whether fermented foods have been shown to help prevent cancer.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Well, what we do know is this: if you take cabbage, cabbage is a cruciferous vegetable. It also happens to be high in fiber. It contains these phytochemicals called isothiocyanins. Isothiocyanins are fighters against cancer. These are chemicals that you get from plants that have been shown to reduce our risk of developing cancer. So, well, that's the backbone of sauerkraut.
Or kimchi. And quite simply, all you have to do is add water and salt, and it will transform itself in a number of days into sauerkraut. So I haven't seen any studies that have directly connected fermented foods to a reduced risk of cancer, but what we do have is this. You know that the gut microbiome is connected to our risk of cancer. You asked me the true or false question. I said true. Those with a healthier gut are at reduced risk of developing colorectal cancer. Well, there was a new study that just came out last summer, Chuck, by Dr. Christopher Gardner at Stanford, and what they showed is that by introducing fermented foods on a daily basis, actually a pretty large amount of fermented foods, but nonetheless, introducing fermented foods on a daily basis allowed people to add diversity to their gut microbiome. So if we were to take that idea and extrapolate it, although I don't have the evidence to completely back this up, expectation is that this reduces our risk of developing colon cancer. And it's still high in fiber.
So we're talking about a healthy biome here, exploring flavors at 12:12. I think this is a phenomenal question. Is it ever really too late to fix your biome?
This is a great question. There are many things about the longitudinal ability to change the gut microbiome that we don't yet know. I welcome the research. I view what we currently have with a sense of humility, recognizing that the things that I say today could change next year. But I choose an optimistic viewpoint of this question. We know that the gut microbiome can shift, can adapt, can change. It can change to the choices that we make. It can be improved, enhanced, fortified. I just mentioned one study, which was a fermented food study, where in a number of weeks it added diversity to the gut microbiome. There are other studies out there for different approaches that are similar in the sense that there are different ways in which we can change and improve our gut microbiome. So I'm of the belief that our gut microbiome can be improved, can be enhanced, and the extent of how far we can take it is the question in my mind. It's not a question of can we do it, can we make it better? Yes, we can. The question is how far can we take it? And that's, there are limitations to each of us. Like if my goal is to become as strong as I possibly can on the bench press, well, I can really make myself way stronger in terms of the bench press. Can I bench press 500 pounds? No, but I'm still very strong on the bench press. Isn't that what matters?
Oh, I think if you put your mind to it, you could put up 5 kills on that, no problem, Dr. B. Question from TR from Canada checking in today. Thanks for checking in. What foods and how should I introduce them back into my gut right after the colonoscopy? So they're looking at, I guess, almost resetting their microbiome right after the colonoscopy because you can empty out.
Yeah, this is a great question, one that I often get with regard when I talk about colonoscopies or things around colonoscopies. And I'm actually doing a thorough breakdown on this topic in my newsletter to people who are on my list this Friday. So if you guys are interested in hearing my full breakdown on this topic, sign up for my newsletter at the Plant Fed Gut. But the short of it, Chuck, is that the research indicates that our gut microbiome does have a change that takes place after we do a cleanse or a flush or colonoscopy. And that change does exist for about 2 weeks. So we have this 2-week window where we have an opportunity to enhance and restore our gut biome by treating it properly. So it is a vulnerability. It also is an opportunity to do the best and eat it the best way. So what did I do? Well, after I was done with my colonoscopy, I took a prebiotic fiber supplement and I immediately had a plant-based meal. We want plant-based eating before colonoscopy, and we want plant-based eating after colonoscopy. And the reason why is that fiber is the fuel for our gut microbes. That's what they want. So, but I didn't go and have a raw salad. That would be putting my gut microbiome when it's in a state of vulnerability to work with a little bit more than perhaps it could handle. Instead, what I did is I went with simple stuff. So I actually had a black bean soup. Beans, plant fiber, gut-resistant starches, but it's also cooked, softened. Soft and cooked is where I would recommend that people begin. There are some other things that I talk about in this newsletter that's coming out on Friday, so it may be worth checking out for people who are interested.
And there's a link to that right now in the show description, so if you just want to click on over and get yourself signed up as you're watching us today, go for it. I'm going to combine 2 questions from Jessica and Juliet. Jessica, unfortunately, is asking the question, what should you eat if you've been diagnosed with cancer? And then Juliet's question is, will eating a vegan diet reduce the risk of the colorectal cancer returning?
I can answer both of those questions with one word, yes. So there have been studies where they have looked at people after the diagnosis of colorectal cancer, and the increase in dietary fiber increases life expectancy, reduces risk of recurrence. So from my perspective, the goal here, whether you are on the diet beforehand or not, the goal is to shift yourself towards a plant-based diet so that you can properly fuel and support a healthy gut biome and simultaneously
just absolutely bathe it in short-chain fatty acids, because when those short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, are there, that's the path that we have, that we want in terms of protecting ourselves.
And Charlie's wondering, other than poor diet and family history, I suppose, what are the other causes that we know of colorectal cancer?
Alcohol, tobacco, sedentary lifestyle, obesity. These are some of the other risk factors that have been, that they've attributed the shift towards a younger population. Diet is a part of the story. Genetics are definitely a part of the story. So these are the things that we've been looking at.
Phoebe, 1215, let's talk spices and microbiome. Are the spices, like those found in hot curries, bad for the microbiome?
No, they're good. They're great. Curry is incredible because it's a blend of multiple different spices. You know, one of the things that's exciting about plant-based eating, one of the things that I love, is that the herbs and the spices all come from plants. Like, what animal product provides the flavor that we sprinkle onto our food? And so, and the things that have a really profound, powerful flavor, you are tasting a phytochemical. That's what you are actually tasting. And that phytochemical, I mean, just categorically, when you look downstream, the herbs and spices, their phytochemicals are anti-inflammatory and they are healing. They are beneficial. So anything could be consumed to excess, Chuck. I mean, you know, you could always overdo it with something. You could do it with kale. But the point is that these varieties of herbs and spices, like particularly Eastern spices in India, they're incredible. They're so good for us, and they taste great too.
Here's a great question from Edith. Do polyps ever disappear on their own? This one came in at 1220.
It might. It might. I've seen cases of patients that have multiple polyps and go in expecting to find more, and they're no longer there after they do a lifestyle change. I do want to make one point about this though. So polyps can rise, they can regress. Not every single polyp will necessarily turn into cancer. There have to be the right climate or circumstances for that transformation to take place. But there's no way for you to know. And there's only one way to be safe, which is frankly to remove the polyp. But that being said, I do think that diet and lifestyle can be an important factor. But timing needs to be considered. I've seen a lot of patients. So I've had a lot of patients who come to me and I do a colonoscopy and they have polyps. And they go, "Oh, doc, that's so disappointing. I changed my diet. I'm eating the way that you described in fiber fuel." And I'm like, "Well, how long have you been doing that?" And they say, "For the last 18 months.
You have to understand, these polyps are already starting to form even years in advance of when we can see them with our eye. Right? On a cellular level, that transformation is already taking place. So you can't expect a dietary change to go into effect the second that you make the change. The effect is like banking interest year after year. The interest may start off small in year 1, but by the time you get to year 20, you're rich. That's what you want.
There you go. Question from Alpine. This one comes up. We were just talking about sauerkraut, and so that brings sodium into the equation. Alpine's question at 1224. Are you concerned about the sodium content that's found in fermented vegetables?
Look, the average American is over-consuming. The average American is consuming sodium. We need to reduce our sodium consumption. But the idea of reducing sodium consumption doesn't mean that we need to completely avoid moderate quantities of healthy fermented foods that have been demonstrated to have health benefits for us, right? Reduce the sodium intake by reducing your ultra-processed food intake, by reducing your fried food intake, where 60% of the average American's calories, that's where they're getting the calories from is from ultra-processed foods. So we need to contract that. We don't need to be reducing our intake of moderate quantities of healthy foods that do contain some sodium. I think that to vilify sodium to the point that you say any food that contains sodium must inherently be bad is to fixate on a single nutrient and miss the bigger picture of the food. Is the food healthy? Are we nourishing our body? Are people thriving because they consume those foods? And if the answer is yes, then let's not be fixating on this micronutrient.
You talk about like just focusing on one nutrient here. That kind of brings the conversation of a reductionist view of health into the equation. And I know that that's something you and I actually spoke about when I was down there building out the studio with you, is how difficult it can be to kind of, for somebody who isn't a doctor, to kind of navigate these health borders. What is and is not healthy? What's the right balance there when we tend to focus on that one thing? From a doctor's perspective, what is your take on this reductionist view of health and medicine?
I think, first of all, I think that I would applaud many of the people within the plant-based movement who actually have pioneered the idea that we need to have a bigger picture
to health and not take a reductionist view. You know, T. Colin Campbell, to me, has been the pioneer who's out there beating the drum, saying, don't look at the micronutrient, look at the food, what happens when you eat the food. And he is absolutely right. And we see far too often where we will reduce something to its gluten, its lectins, right? And then we're avoiding beans when, because we're concerned about lectins, when, we have quite clear studies that show us that among multiple different populations, people live longer with less disease, less heart disease, our number one killer, less cancer, our number two killer, when they consume beans. Right? So I think it's important to not fixate on these micronutrients, that we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture with our food. What happens when real people eat this food? That's the question that every single one of us needs to ask. Now, myself and other people within the plant-based community, we will beat this drum and we will say, don't be reductionist. T. Colin Campbell is right? I'm saying it literally right now. And then it's a slippery slope. It's very easy to fixate on specific things, like I could say saturated fat is bad, right? And the problem is that the average American is way over consuming saturated fat because they have far too many animal products in their diet. But to actually say saturated fat is bad when in fact if some people were consuming a small amount of saturated fat in moderation, that's not destroying their health. So we need to again see the bigger picture here.
Next week, I'm going to have the Shurzais, Dean and Aisha Shurzai, on the show, and they're going to talk about exercise and the role that plays with brain health. But I also think today exercise is an important part of the conversation that you and I are having. So let's take a question here from Colleen at 1225. Colleen wants to know, how much does exercise or physical activity play into reducing the risk of colorectal cancer?
It absolutely is part of the story. It absolutely part. And you know, what's amazing about this, Chuck, is that exercise, even moderate amounts of exercise, amounts that if I say to you, hey, can you give me 15 minutes? And I'm not talking about 15 minutes running 20 miles an hour through your neighborhood, right? I'm saying 15 minutes of a moderate exercise where you perhaps don't even break a major sweat. Can you give me that? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. And I actually was a part of a study that we published recently in the journal Gut Microbes with people from the
University of Nottingham. Dr. Anna Valdez was the leader of the study. And what we found is that in this intervention study, where people were asked to walk for 15 minutes, it actually caused a shift and a change in their gut microbiome that led to an increased production of short-chain fatty acids. There was no dietary shift. There was no dietary change. We weren't telling them to eat more fiber.
15 minutes of exercise changes the gut microbiome, produces more short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids protect us from colorectal cancer. And when we look at the data, does exercise reduce our risk? The studies are saying yes.
Let's take a question from Lori at 1224. This kind of goes to the heart of what it was we were talking about last show. Is there any connection between chronic constipation and colon cancer or polyps?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes people characterize constipation as being like you are retaining toxins. And it actually goes back to a philosophy from the 1800s.
I haven't seen any evidence that like constipation is the retention of toxins, but I do know that people feel better when their body is in rhythm. That is quite indisputable. I haven't seen anything, Chuck, that has directly connected constipation to colorectal cancer. It may be out there, I just haven't seen it. But I haven't seen that specifically, but I think that, regardless of that, one thing that we do know that is very important for people to hear is that if you have a change in bowel habits, right, like you were not constipated and now you are struggling with constipation, this is actually a reason to get a diagnostic colonoscopy. And the reason that we do it is not just to diagnose the constipation, it's that sometimes that's the way that colorectal cancer presents itself. So again, it's not necessary that the constipation caused the cancer, it can be that the cancer caused the constipation. But
the awareness that when you have a change in bowel habits, and you see blood in your stool, if you're anemic without an explanation, if you're low on iron without an explanation, if you're having fatigue and weakness without an explanation, these are reasons to get checked out and potentially consider a colonoscopy.
So, yeah, that happened to me right when I was beginning the show. I was still working in news, and I was actually in school at the time as well. And this was at the beginning of the exam room. I don't think I ever really talked about this on the show. Had so much stress in my life, so little sleep, that I developed a bleeding ulcer and lost a lot of blood unbeknownst to me at the time. And it got to a point where I couldn't even stand up. I remember doing a live event for the physicians committee, and like literally basically collapsed backstage, and I thought, like, what is going on here? And then I wound up spending the next 3 days in the hospital. Wound up having my first colonoscopy then at the age of 35. And that was a scary thing, because I did think going into that, even though I had a lot on my plate in life, I was eating a really healthy diet, and then still, ran into this obstacle. And that was just, it was a heck of a thing. But yeah, man, I mean, pay attention to those changes. Definitely pay attention into your changes. What you just said was spot on, I can tell you from a patient experience. Let's take a question here from Jennifer. We're just going to do a hard pivot here. Jennifer's question, this is just kind of a curiosity one. Why does Pepto-Bismol darken your stool?
That's the bismuth. So if you were to take bismuth in any form or variety, which bismuth is the active ingredient in Pepto-Bismol. So the bismuth will turn your stool black. Some other things that will turn your stool black: iron supplements. So like iron sulfate will turn your stool black. Bismuth, blueberries, if you like consume a large quantity of blueberries, it could turn your stool black. So, and of course, people know that beets can turn your stool red.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to nutrients here. We talked a little bit about, we talked about fermented foods. Kombucha always comes up in the conversation when we bring that up. Remy's question at 12:32, since we had talked about salt, Remy's wondering about the sugar in kombucha and whether that could potentially be harmful.
Well, most likely, if you're drinking kombucha, most likely you're going to be purchasing it from the store. And what you need to do is you need to look at the number of grams of number of grams of sugar that exists within that kombucha. Kombucha that is more sour, it's kind of like how a wine can be sweeter or it can be more dry. And kombucha that is lower in sugar is going to be more dry, whereas the ones that they're cranking up the sugar, getting into 15 grams of sugar or more, those are the ones that it's going to taste sweeter. So, let's not lose sight of the fact that the food industry wants to sell you something that you smack your lips and say, that tastes great, and therefore I go back to the store and buy it again, right? So let's not lose sight of that. So it's in their interest to put sugar into these beverages. You just need to be conscious of it and pay attention to it. I want less than 15 grams of fiber in my less than 15 grams of sugar in my kombucha. If you make it at home, the sugar is consumed by the microbes. And so the acidity starts to rise and the sugar levels decrease. So if you make it at home, you control the amount of sugar that goes in there, and you also control how long you allow it to ferment. So if you basically stop fermenting it earlier on, it will be less acidic and more like a sweet tea. But as you allow it to go, it becomes less sweet and more acidic, and that's because the sugar is being consumed and turned into acid.
You know what? We have a few people right now in the chat who are wondering about the home test for colorectal cancer screenings and how effective they are. Are they accurate, or is the colonoscopy still the gold standard here? What would your advice be?
So I think it's a hugely important topic because there is a convenience problem. It is way too convenient to do an at-home test, and there has been unnecessary vilification of colonoscopy with like a
Reporting that the risks of colonoscopy are exceedingly high. The risks of colonoscopy are not exceedingly high. In the medical practice